Kalam podcast is made possible through listeners like you. If you enjoy listening to Kalam, please subscribe to the show in whatever podcast application you're listening to right now, and please give us a rating. It helps other people find out about us. And if you'd like to support the show with a small donation, consider signing up to Kalam Podcast on Patreon for just $3 a month. In addition to supporting the show, you'll gain access to lots of great bonus content. Go to patreon.com and search for Kalam Podcast, or go straight to patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. That's patreon.com/Kalam Podcast. Now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the fifth installment of Kalam Digest with me, Edgar Mannheimer, and Sam Karlsheimer. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We're recording on the 10th of September 2024. Some of the things we're going to be talking about today is the piece of news in Jordan the other day. A Jordanian man killed three Israeli soldiers at a border crossing. A newspaper in Israel reveals that the government in Israel spread false documents about Hamas to change public opinion, and the economic crisis in Israel deepens. But first, Sam, let's start in Gaza. 40 persons were killed in an attack at the Al Mawazi refugee campsite in Khan Yunis. What happened here, Sam?
Well, it seems the Israelis just bombarded a tent camp in Khan Yunis, in one of the very few remaining so-called safe zones.
Yeah.
Obviously not very safe. At least 40 dead, and that's a very preliminary number. It's hard to just find words to describe this. It's it just keeps going on.
A year on, and they're bombing tents. The
pictures. The image is coming out. Also, it's horrible because it's on a beach. So there's just sand underneath. So the craters are many meters deep, and people are buried in the sand. And
I saw a video of children being pulled out of, instead of being pulled out of rubble, being pulled out of deep craters in the sand. It's completely devoid of humanity. In speaking of Gaza, the school year is started because it's back to school season for most kids in the world, and 90% of the schools in Gaza are destroyed. So 650,000 kids will probably not be able to go have proper schooling or kindergarten this fall, or probably this whole year.
Yeah, they already missed a school year basically since October, and Palestinian society is very resilient. They're trying to organize kindergartens and schools to the extent possible, and inside these camps or just wherever outside or in a tent or something. But it's obviously children are missing out on schooling. Let's hope not for another year, but at least for foreseeable future.
And what about the vaccinations? We spoke about that last time. Vaccination against polio, which has been documented in Gaza. That was a very short-lived ceasefire to administer. Obviously, it's not administer all of these hundreds of thousands of vaccinations. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so the Gaza has been divided into three zones. They started out with the middle section of Gaza, which was vaccinated, I think, a bit more than a week ago. And then the second area was the south, which has also been, I think, somewhat effectively vaccinated. But the last third zone in the north, the vaccination plan is under threat of failing there totally, because the Israelis have stopped the UN convoy trying to bring vaccinations or the medications to the north. According to the UN spokesperson, they were held at gunpoint throughout the night, and also a lot of the trucks were damaged by Israeli bulldozers, which drove into them. Why exactly this happens is not clear, if it's just the Israelis running rampage, or if it's some kind of a conflict between the UN and Israel over this specific thing. It's not clear, but of course, as long as not every area is vaccinated, the whole plan might fail.
Yeah, basically. It kind of renders the whole thing moot, doesn't it?
You might still have an epidemic in the north then.
Exactly. Just like epidemics don't respect borders, they also don't respect Israeli military divisions of Palestinian land.
No, they don't.
Okay, so on the topic of the recurring segment of the imminent regional war in the Middle East, last week 18 people were killed in Israeli airstrikes over Syria. So the escalation is continuing, even though I guess it's not as imminent as it was maybe when we started this digest series a few weeks ago. What's the latest there?
I mean, so the cross-border fire between Lebanon and Israel is ongoing, but for the rest, it seems to have returned to normalcy, which is basically that Israel bombs different countries around the region without anything happening in return, mostly.
Yeah,
Syria is obviously keeping very, very low profile. They're probably arming or supporting Hezbollah as they usually do, but there's been no even hint at Syria retaliating. Even
mm,
though Israel has the last decade, it's been hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria. They're basically doing that without any retaliation from Syria.
right.
They're just too afraid to get involved, it seems, which is understandable, but still, it's also kind of an absurd situation where one party to the conflict just with impunity bombs the other, and they don't
Yeah.
basically dare to respond. This is a bigger thing than it's usually been. It's 18 people dead, and it seems they've struck also civilian installations, etc. So might be that the Syrians feel that they need to do something,
Yeah.
to.
Remains to be seen. Okay, and so when it comes to the situation on the West Bank, the invasion of Jenin, which has been ongoing for the past week or two, is temporarily halted, according to the Israeli military. But they really have, I mean, destroyed large parts of the city, and at least 20
Yeah.
Palestinians were killed last week. What's the latest there?
Yeah, well, so the Israelis seem to have withdrawn somewhat from Jenin, or at least they have moved to the outskirts, and they're not fighting inside the city as they've been for a long time. This is a recurring thing, as most people who follow Palestine know, that Jenin is one of the centers of resistance to the Israeli occupation, so they move in recurringly. But the last invasion has been one of the worst since 2000, the early 2000s, where during the Second Intifada. But the destruction is monumental, and a lot of people have been killed. We're not sure how many. 20 is what we know from the last couple of days of the invasion, might probably a lot more in total. And in general, the Israelis have been invading or attacking other cities around the West Bank, Nablus, Balata camp, of course, outside Nablus, Tulkarem, and also Al Khalil, Hebron in the south. It seems they're putting Hebron under some kind of let's say not reoccupying it, but some kind of curfew or blockade, a huge thing. Hebron is one of the biggest cities on the West Bank. It competes with Nablus for being the biggest city, and it's pretty sprawling and pretty quietist, but it's very Islamist
Yeah,
traditionally.
yeah,
It's a right-wing city. It's a Hamas-aligned city, let's say.
yeah,
Well, Nablus is more to the left. So we're not
right.
sure what that means, but it might be that they've had reports about resistance activity, let's say. Also, there's been, there was, I think a week ago, three Israeli soldiers were shot, or in some other, I don't know if maybe they were run over by a Palestinian man in the vicinity of
Yeah,
Hebron.
right. Yeah, exactly. Which segues into one of our main stories, which is a Jordanian man killing three Israeli soldiers at the Allenby Bridge border crossing, or the in Arabic Karame border crossing between Jordan and the occupied West Bank. This is a car crossing, sort of. So this man got out of his car and shot three Israeli soldiers before being killed himself, and this was
Yeah.
met with exuberant celebrations in the Jordanian capital Amman. People were shooting fireworks and calling him a hero.
Yeah.
What does this mean?
We talked about this last episode, the Israeli and, of course, Egyptian fear that Egyptian soldiers would go rogue on the
Yeah,
border, which has happened. It's not very common, but it has happened, even in quote unquote peace times. Um, so this is an example of that, even though this was not a Jordanian soldier, it was an ordinary Jordanian truck driver, lorry driver,
yeah,
who just managed to get his hands on some guns, and then he shot. I don't think it was actually soldiers; it was armed border police or border guards
right, okay,
at the LMB crossing. So of course it's extremely embarrassing for the Israelis. Their whole position in this situation is they have to be the superior party, the party in power at all times, and just having a random lorry driver killing their personnel is not a good look.
No.
But of course, it was extremely embarrassing for the Jordanians, who have the responsibility against the Israelis to keep their side of the border safe. And as you
Yeah.
said, I mean, there were celebrations around the Arab world and specifically in Amman, and this is very dangerous to the government in Jordan. So
Yeah.
it's we know it's a monarchy with some semblance of democratic elections, but very far from an actual democracy. And the king and his entourage, of course, know that the fact that they have a peace agreement with Israel is one of the things that their population likes the least about their
Yeah.
regime. I don't think, I mean, there's no question of the king or ever like backing down from having a peace agreement with Israel, but they need to find some middle way here because, they see the celebrations where a single Jordanian man actually resisted the Israelis, and everyone's just celebrating this
Yeah.
this guy.
Calling him a hero. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was Queen Rania is her name, I think.
Yes.
She had made this speech somewhere, I think, a couple of days ago, where she took a much more harsh kind of stance on Israel, being much more critical and talking about how, Israel is unacceptable in their policies, etc.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not like the Jordanian king and queen usually love Israel, even personally, but
No, but
it's much more harsh kind of rhetoric. I think they're trying to navigate this.
yeah, I think it
It's
was a direct response to people celebrating this guy going on the sort of rampage against the Israeli soldiers, for sure,
yeah.
to try to like take control over the narrative, basically.
Also, I mean, you have to remember there's been a lot of these kinds of suicide attacks because even though they're
Yeah.
not suicide bombers, they're basically suicide attacks. Everyone, including themselves, know that they will be killed as soon as possible, by the Israelis. There's been a number of similar attacks around the West Bank ongoing. Most of them are not reported because the people are just killed right away.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are car attacks where Palestinians randomly drive their cars into checkpoints or into army postings.
Yeah. And I and,
Usually
and I
no
mean,
one's killed except for the perpetrator, of course.
yeah, and in a way, I mean, it's more in a way, I mean, it depends what you put into the word effective, but with a suicide bombing, it's very hard to avoid, civilian casualties. In these kind of operations, I've not seen one single Israeli civilian so far in these most recent sort of suicide operations being killed because it's very directed at army personnel.
Yeah, exactly.
Moving on, a newspaper article has revealed that the Israeli government spread false documents about Hamas to change opinion. This is the Israeli daily Yediot Aronot. Sam, what have they revealed? What has been divulged here?
So what's been revealed is something that most people would probably think was already well known, but this is at least they have security sources to prove this, that the Israeli regime with Netanyahu leading it has been publishing false documents or falsified documents purporting to say things about Hamas trying to smuggle hostages and even the leadership of Hamas themselves fleeing the Gaza Strip into Egypt. And this, of course, would be used to argue that Israel has to retain control over the Egypt Gaza border at all times.
Right, this is
There's
a
a
part of the
number
whole
of
Philadelphia corridor discourse.
Exactly, the whole we need to stay in control of these military important corridors, as we call them. There's also a number of other claims being made. These have been published in Bild, the German magazine, and Jewish Chronicle. So, of course, I mean, this is to anyone who's, let's say, skeptical about Israeli claims, doesn't come as a surprise. But of course, just as with the revelation that they had used the Hannibal directive
Yeah,
on 7th of October against their own citizens, it's very embarrassing. It's deeply embarrassing to
yeah.
Israeli
It
government and specifically to the security establishment.
Yeah, it hits differently when an Israeli newspaper provides concrete evidence proving something, and when like pro-Palestinian activists make a claim. Obviously,
Absolutely.
Israel can always just say that all these people are anti-Semitic and they hate us, but it's very hard to to
Yeah.
have the same kind of dismissive rhetoric against the largest daily newspaper in Israel.
Yeah, which is also, of course, I mean, Idiot Ahronot it's not pro Netanyahu, but it's very much not a leftist
It's
magazine.
not
It's not.
Haaretz.
Yeah, Haaretz is, I mean, to us, it's a very respectable newspaper, but even in, the same situation where people in Israel would say, well, it's Haaretz, they
Yeah,
they hate
exactly.
us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's not the same case
Um,
with the Idiot Aronot.
Not at all. It's a very like just centrist, let's say, quote unquote, apolitical newspaper.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting quote here also, Edut Ahronot saying, this has given rise to great concern and anger in the security establishment, and it is assumed that it will heighten the tensions between them and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and
Mm.
his men. So this is just the latest, let's say, scene in an ongoing story of deepening conflict between Netanyahu and his far-right government, or
On the
this
one
coalition
hand,
of
yeah,
far-right parties, and a military establishment which is also obviously not anything but right-wing, but which is much more, let's say, realistic or skeptical about his political aims
yeah,
and wants to kind of try to get out of the situation in a way that isn't too embarrassing and that reaches some goals, but they are fine with kind of an, for example, with a ceasefire agreement or with some kind of deal,
yeah.
while the right-wing
Yeah,
parties in the
the
government
security
does not want
establishment
that.
doesn't wanna conduct this kind of total war, this kind of existential, Hitler
Yeah.
kind of like in his bunker kind of operation. I mean, they they're just like looking at it a bit more realistically. But so how does this story tie into the larger culture war and like Israeli society? I mean, there were almost 750,000 people, three-quarters of a million. I saw
Yeah.
some reports saying protesting in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, I mean, you have the same situation, I still think, ongoing. It seems over the last week since we last recorded, opinion has been shifting away from Netanyahu again, to some extent, with people, Israeli citizens, being more kind of pro a hostage deal and less pro the total war approach, as you very aptly called it. But still, it's very much a society split evenly down the middle, where, in Tel Aviv, for example, which is a much more secular city,
Mm.
there's a lot of more criticism against Netanyahu and other parts of the country, especially Jerusalem, of course. It's much more conservative. You have much more stronger support for whatever the government wants to do.
Yeah,
And, it's a culture war. You're totally right on that, but it's also a political conflict where it's not just Netanyahu, but his supporters know that he is kind of their strongest asset because he is,
yeah,
I mean, he's hated by many people, but he's also been in power basically for, 25 years, 30 years at
yeah,
this
yeah,
point. He's incredibly good at staying in power and has proven a very strong leader for the right. And they know that as soon as this war ends, he will probably be indicted on corruption charges in
hmm,
general, and also will, of course, you know, things will surface on the
yeah,
topic of how ill-managed Israel has been in the last couple of years before
for
7th of
sure.
October. So it's just also like, let's keep our guy in power
Yeah,
versus let's
sure.
bring this guy down. We'll see what happens.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's a cultural war, but also like a very specifically a political conflict between, let's say, extreme right wing and liberal conservative, moderate right wing,
yeah.
which is.
Okay, so for our last story, the economic crisis in Israel is deepening despite large, support packages, financial packages from the West. Sam, what's going on here?
So yes, the economical problems in Israel deepen. Specifically, the state budget is 8% in an 8% deficit for August, and this has been getting worse month by month now, from a couple of percents in the start of the year to 8% now. This is 12 billion shekels, and just this month, I think, equals something like $4 billion.
Yeah,
So yeah, as you said, this is despite the fact that the US and the West are basically giving them everything they want in terms of money and armament. So it's just the deficit is running rampant anyway. This is of course a huge issue for Israel. Conducting a war is something they're good at, quote unquote, in the sense that they usually kill the opponent and anyone else
yeah,
standing in the way, but they're not good at winning wars in terms of winning them decisively, let's say strategically, politically. They're just stuck in this ongoing conflict now.
yeah,
And I think this is also something you have to remember. Why is the army establishment so skeptical about just this total war, let's keep going thing? They know that the economy can't really deal with that.
Okay, well, we'll be following all of those developments closely. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining me today on the fifth installment of Kalam Digest on the 10th of September, 2024.
Thank you, Edgar. Bye.